Welcome to the tutorial Rendering Movies and Image Sequences in Animate Pro. So for this tutorial, we're going to use the scene where we learned how to animate the Karate Rabbit using inverse kinematics. And I'll just play the scene again to remind you what that looked like. There we go. So in Animate Pro, in order to render movies or image sequences, we have to use the network view. So the network view is more powerful than the file menu for exporting, which is all you have in Animate, because it allows you to make advanced connections and render only certain parts of your drawing. For example, we have actually two displays in this network. There's one for just the Karate Rabbit, and there's one for the composite. So right now we're on the display that's hooked to the composite. So everything that's hooked up into the composite we should be able to see right now in the camera view, because that's the display that's selected in the display toolbar, which is this thing right here. If we want to see just what's being viewed in this display, the Karate Rabbit display, we can select it from the drop down, and we can see that it's possible to only see part of your scene. And if it's possible to only display part of your scene, then it's also possible to render just part of your scene. So I'll go back to the display, or the display and all in this case happens to be exactly the same. Another advantage of using the network view is that you can make multiple renders or multiple exports, and you can do this by connecting several write modules in your network view. So I'm getting a little ahead of myself, so let's go back a bit and take a look at write modules. So in our scenes, or the scenes that we've provided thus far, I think all of them have come with write modules already connected to the composite. However, if there is no write module in your scene or connected to your final composite, you can always get it from the module library in either the all or the favorites, I believe. So if we scroll down, it'll be somewhere near the bottom. So you can always drop another write module or multiple write modules into your network view. So write module, as you may have guessed, is what controls the export of movies and image sequences, and it outputs all the connected imagery from your scene. So let's start by looking at how to output an image sequence. So to bring up the write module's layer properties, you can click on this yellow box. And by default, it's set to export an image sequence, and we know this because drawing is selected instead of movie down here. So right away we can see that it has many similarities to the exporting image sequence window in Animate, but let's start at the beginning. The first option you have is to actually enable or disable this write module. So you can see it automatically turn red to show that it's disabled in the network view. The second option that we have here is to change the name of the write module. And if you're going to connect this write module to, say, the Karate Rabbit, you might want to rename it Karate Rabbit Write, just so you remember what this write module is doing. Then in the output section here, we have the option of choosing where we would like to save this file. And once again, by default, it's going to be saved in the frames folder for this scene. So the scene is called Animating with IK. However, I'm going to choose a different place to export these images. And I'll put it, of course, with all the other renders that we've been making so far. And then I have the option of changing the file name. So this is the name that you'll see as the title for every single image, along with a dash and then a number. So once again, I was saying that final isn't a really descriptive title, so I'm going to rename this to Karate Rabbit Scene, and I've actually decided to put this after 2, so I'm going to call it 2B. The other one I'll rename 2A, and this one will be 2B dash, and then we can decide here if we want the starting number to be 1 or something else. It doesn't have to start at 1. We can change the number of leading zeros. So I don't know if you noticed, but the image sequence that I exported for the OpenGL frames, I actually didn't have enough leading zeros. So it goes from a 2-digit number like 0, 1, 12, 22, and it jumps to a 3-digit number such as 127. So some people consider that pretty messy. So if you know if you're going to have a 3 or 4-digit number as your last frame number, it's always good to make sure you have at least that many leading zeros for your first few frames. So I'll leave it at 0001, but once again you can choose any number from that drop-down menu. Then you can choose the file type that you'd like to export. So this time let me choose something different just for the sake of choosing something different. I'll choose JPEG because once again I don't need any transparency in this scene. And then we can close this and nothing's going to happen. So you haven't written anything. It's just you've set what the right module has the potential of exporting. But to do the exporting, you do have to go to the file menu. So if we do go to the file menu, we can go to export, and you'll see that it doesn't say image sequence in the list as it does in Animate. However, we do have this option, render network. So if I click on that, then we get a second dialog box that opens called the Render Network dialog box. And this is where I'm able to select the range. So I'm going to select all my frames. Once again, I have the option of previewing, so I can decide to preview or not to preview. So this time I won't preview. And then I'm going to select OK. So then if we go back to our Finder, and we go back to our Pack 22 folder, we can see that all of our images have been exported with the correct prefix or scene name, as well as a dash and then the suffix being the number. And it goes down to 39, so I probably didn't need to export it with this many leading zeros. So once again, I'm going to put all of those in a folder. And keep them there for safekeeping. So we're going to close that. So the second thing we'd like to look at obviously is the MOV render. So if I click on this yellow box again, I'll get my same layer properties, and everything that I've changed so far remains as is. So the difference would be is that if I click on the movie, it disables anything that has to do with the drawing view, but it also reverted back to the default place to save, which is in the frames folder, and the default name for an MOV is output instead of final dash, which it is for an image sequence. So once again, I'm going to select my usual folder, and I'm going to rename. So the only thing that's left are the movie options. So you can always click on this customize button to view them. But what I'm going to do is refer you to the previous tutorial exporting your movie to go through all the different video and audio settings for an MOV. So I'm just going to cancel this, and I'm also going to close the layer properties box. So once again, nothing is going to happen. We just saved the export settings for this right module, but we haven't actually exported anything. So now to export all the images from this composite as an MOV, you would have to go back to the File menu and select Export and select Render Network. But I'm not going to do it this time since we already have an image sequence render of this scene. So now let's talk about multiple renders. So as I was mentioning earlier, you can actually have multiple renders, and you can do this by having multiple write modules. So we already have 2 here, but let's add a couple more, or at least one more. So let me bring this one up towards the karate rabbit, and I just have to hook it in like this, and now I'll be able to write just what's coming out of this group. And I'm going to rename this just so that I don't forget. Also rename this Write Karate Rabbit for now. We'll keep this one as just Write because it's coming from the composite, and I'll keep this as Write number 2 until I make any changes. So the great thing about this multiple writing system is that you can write several versions of your scene, or you can write different elements from your scene with different resolutions and different outputs, and you can do this all simultaneously, so it saves a lot of time. As soon as you go to the File menu and select that menu item, Export Render Network, Any of the write modules that are enabled will write simultaneously. The one important thing to remember is that you must change the output name for all of your write modules. All three write modules in this case happen to be exporting movies, and the movie's name is output for all three of them. They'll just write over each other. So you'll only end up having one rendered version of your scene even though you tried to write three separate files. So other than changing the type of export to either an image sequence or an MOV, there are a few other things you can do or add to your write module, and that's to both scale your output or crop it. So let's go back to the module library and let's take a look at the scale output first. So because we're in our all modules tab, we can see it right here, scale output. So I'm going to drop that into the network view. And let me actually attach the second write module. And let me insert the scale output between the write module and the composite by holding down the Alt key and dragging it across. With the exception of rendering OpenGL frames, you never get the option of rendering a low-res version of your scene. There are several reasons why you may want to render a lower res version, anything from wanting to put your scene up on the web or rendering a small test. So there is actually a way that you can export a lower res version of your scene without having to go to the scene settings and actually changing your scene settings to be low res. You should always keep your scene at the maximum resolution that you'd like to have it, and then use the scale effect or the scale output module here to render a scaled down version of your scene. So let's go into the layer properties for the scale output. Once again, we have the option to enable or disable, as well as rename. So from the scene settings, you saw that there was a list of typical resolutions. So you can select one of them from this drop-down list. And if you had made customized resolutions, they would also be available on this list. So I could select low, for example, and you see that in the display, all of a sudden, we see what this would look like at low resolution. And I'll put that back to nothing. Or you could select custom resolution and enter the values here, and then click on the close button. Then what I would do is probably rename this write module so that I know it's writing something low res, such as maybe low res. If I'm rendering an image sequence, I might name it images, and then I'd always write that it's a write module, so I'm never confused as to what kind of a module that is. So be aware that you should never go in reverse. You should never start with a project that's at a very low resolution and then use the scale output to create a higher res version of your scene. Once again, you should always be producing your animation at a very high resolution because it's always easier to create lower res versions, but it's almost always impossible to go in reverse. So the second module I wanted to look at was the crop module, and if we go to the top here, we can find the crop and drag and drop it into our network view. So I might also drop another write module in. And what I'll do is I'll connect the crop and then connect it to the write and have the write module down here. So you can use the crop module to output two files with different aspect ratios. For example, if your scene is 16:9, you could output a 4:3 version of your scene. So you wouldn't actually be outputting a 4:3 version because that would inevitably warp your scene. What you would do is you would crop out the excess information and make a 4:3 ratio crop. So let's go into the layer properties for the crop module and take a look. So obviously you can create your new frame here by giving an X and a Y value or a height and a width for your frame. If you've noticed, you can also offset this frame. So for example, it doesn't need to be in the center. You could actually have it here in the corner, for example, or in the lower corner. And not only can you offset it, as well as change the dimensions of your crop, but you can obviously animate all these things over time. And you might see right away that why that would be useful. The main action of this frame might be going on here for the first bit of your animation, but then it might be going on more in the bottom right hand corner, for example. And if you're not able to render your full scene at 16:9 or whatever, you would need to actually move that 4:3 frame to different places to make sure that you're constantly getting the best image or the best part of the animation. So let's actually enter some values in here. I want to stay in the same ratio, so I'm going to enter in 360 by 270. So those are the same values that we saw for the low resolution setting, but don't get confused because the low resolution was actually going to scale the entire image to a smaller size. Here we're going to crop an image that happens to be the same dimension. And you can see when I added the crop module to this right, a blue frame suddenly appeared in the camera view, and as you can see, now that I've changed the values, it's become smaller. So I guess you get the idea that this is your crop. And if we offset it, you can see even further what I mean. So maybe we'll offset it by, say, like 100 pixels, something like that. And maybe that is more what we're looking for. It has the Karate Rabbit's face, it has the punching bag, so that's more like the type of crop that we want. The draw frame, what that does, if you check it, is it actually will render your scene in full, but it'll put this blue crop mark around, so you can see where a potential crop could be in the render. And you can actually change the color of that frame as well as the alpha. So I don't know if you noticed, but both in the right module and in the crop module, there's an enabling tab. So I'm going to click on this tab, and they actually look identical. We didn't actually look at the one in the right module, but I assure you it looks exactly the same. So the features that you have for the crop is that it can always be enabled for this right module, or you can decide to enable this cropping only when the resolution is at a certain setting. For example, when the resolution is low. So in this case, nothing would happen because this right module is not set to low. There is no scale output that is setting this to low. This resolution is actually NTSC. So if you kept it at NTSC, then yes, in fact, this would crop properly. So this allows you to have some control over when the cropping will occur, or instead you also can enable when the resolution is, and it gives you the opportunity to change the X and Y values. So this would also work in this instance, because if we change this to 360 by 270, then once again this crop will be enabled because that happens to be our cropping dimensions. And one important piece of information that I forgot to mention is that you would only set the enabling to one of the two other options if you plan to animate the X and Y resolution. That way, when you finally get to the value that's set in the enabling tab, then the crop will be enabled. Otherwise, you may as well just keep the setting to always enabled. And like I said, this also exists in the right module. So I'm going to close this. And actually what I'd like to show you as well is how we can animate this frame over time. So we can see that the crop appears in our timeline view, which means that we can add keyframes and that we can animate several of its options. So we see here the resolution XY, so that's the actual dimensions, and then we can also see the offset. So for example, if I set the offset back to 0 for both the start and the end keyframe, so that's good, and I started my crop at 360 by 270, but then by the time I got to frame 60, I want to bring it back to the old resolution, which was 720 by 540. You can see that as the movie progresses, the frame becomes bigger. Or we could keep the frame exactly the same and keep it at 360 by 270, and we can actually just animate the offset instead. So here we could have it start in the corner, or actually it was pretty good at 100. And then by the time we get here, it goes up to the top, for example, or Maybe we just wanted to pan across, so we might keep the Y height at 100. But we might pan across. Something like that. So you can do all sorts of things with the cropping in terms of your render, which is a pretty interesting thing to do. And lastly, you can change the velocity or the ease of these keyframe movements. So you can double click on the crop layer and you can click on any of these Bezier curves to actually, animate the speed of the X values, for example. You can do all sorts of things like that using these curves in the layer properties for the crop effect. So I'm just going to rename this right module to maybe cropped pan, and actually let's make this an MOV, so movie, and then I'm just going to change the setting here and close. So now this is a more descriptive name for this right module. And actually I'm just going to rename this one too to make it more consistent and keep the right up front. Like that. Okay, so the last scenario that I'd like to talk to you about is if you start with a higher resolution scene and you want to scale it down to a lower resolution scene, but also that you have it set to HDTV and now you'd like to bring it down to NTSC, for example. So we're going from a 16:9 ratio frame to a 4:3. So what you'll need to do is combine the crop module with the scale module. So let's do a quick setup like that just to show you what it looks like. So for that we have to go back to our module library and we have to take out another scale and another crop. And let me just make this a little bit bigger so we can see what's going on. Okay, so the first thing that you would attach is actually the crop. So I'm going to hold down Alt and drag it across, and then the second module that you would attach is the scale output. So it would look something like this. So you would obviously go into your crop. This is where you would change the ratio because you're not going to actually change the resolution of your scene, you're just going to change the cropping of the framing. So if this was actually longer and rectangular, you would select the selection and put it at a 4:3 ratio in these dimensions that are given here. And then for the scale output, this is where you would change the resolution in terms of making it low or high. So you would from here, for example, make it low, and that way you'd have a low resolution 4:3 from a high resolution 16:9. And then you should obviously rename these appropriately. So that's it for the tutorial rendering movies and image sequences in Animate Pro. Stay tuned for the next tutorial, compositing scenes in a third-party software.